The economic and physical conditions for black men and women in America have declined precipitously, especially since the crash of 2008. Yet most black politicians and intellectuals remain delivery systems for neoliberalism. They blame the victims, those for whom jobs and opportunities do not exist, even as the corporate state orchestrates the largest transfer of wealth upwards in American history. Black apologists for the system call their demands for black personal responsibility tough love. But this stance, music to the ears of the white elite, is morally indefensible. It ignores the harsh reality visited on poor people of color. It ignores the entrenched institutional racism that makes sure the poor remain poor. Courtiers come in different colors in America, but their function is always the same. They are hedonists of power. And if the poor, especially poor people of color, expect to have a voice and agency, they will have to oust many of their own established leaders and embrace a new black radicalism. Anya Parampil examines the crisis that has engulfed African Americans in the United States.
It's been dubbed the new Jim Crow, a separate but equal economic system which has left black Americans far behind their counterparts, despite perceived images of equal opportunity. According to Brandeis University, over the past 25 years, the wealth gap between black and white Americans has nearly tripled. And the numbers speak for themselves. In 2013, the median net worth of white households was $142,000. For black households, that number was $11,000, meaning black households were worth less than 10% of white ones. According to the U.S. Census Bureau's most recent data, 41.7% of black Americans own their homes. Comparatively, 71.5% of non-Hispanic whites own theirs. So how might this disparity be possible? Well, it all boils back to basic income and employment, which, you guessed it, is heavily divided along racial lines. The Bureau of Labor Statistics put the unemployment rate overall most recently at 4.9%. Yet, if you're looking at just African Americans, that number nearly doubles to 8.6% and is likely much higher, considering it doesn't count people who have given up looking for a job, are in jail or in prison. But even if you have a job and are black in America, you're likely making less than your white counterparts. According to data analyzed by the Economic Policy Institute, the median household income for black Americans is $35,000. For white families, it's $60,000. Perhaps considering these numbers, it's no surprise that a recent Pew report found only 8% of black Americans believe enough changes have been made in the United States to grant blacks equal rights. 42% remain hopeful those changes will one day be made. However, 43%, slightly more, believe those changes will never come.
Professor Eddie.
The National Urban League has recently published its annual report on the state of black America. The League is one of the oldest research organizations in the black community, documenting the levels of national oppression and economic exploitation. Its first report was released back in 1976, and it was titled Locked Out, A Message to the Next President, documenting the political and economic struggles that blacks faced at the hands of those who were in the White House and on Wall Street. RT correspondent Ashley Banks gives us insight into what's revealed in the 2016 report.
African Americans remain oppressed and locked out in the U.S. Now, that's according to the National Urban League's recent findings in its annual report on the state of black America. In 1976, the League released Locked Out, Education, Jobs, and Justice, a message to the next president, which provided evidence to suggest African Americans remain oppressed in the U.S. Now here we are 40 years later, and despite the fact the first African American president was elected in 2008 and again in 2012, the fundamental problems facing the black population are still unresolved 151 years after slavery was abolished. The League says overall African Americans do not have full equality, but only 72% of what whites possess. According to the report, there hasn't been much progress towards economic equality. The black unemployment rate is still twice the rate for whites. Compared to 40 years ago, the income gap has remained unchanged, resting at 60%, and the home ownership rate gap has grown 6%, now standing at 59%. Now, on the other hand, there has been slow progress in reducing the black poverty rate. According to the most recent estimates, the black poverty rate is now 2.4% lower than in 1976. And the league also stated over 1/4 of the African American population remains poverty-stricken. The worst state in the U.S. for African American unemployment is Illinois. More specifically, in the city of Chicago, a lot of African Americans are faced with poverty, inequality, and joblessness, giving way to why crime is so high in the city. The Economic Policy Institute conducted a study during the first quarter of 2016. The unemployment rate among blacks living in Illinois was 14.1%. Now that's up from 13.1% during the fourth quarter of 2015. Which was the nation's worst African American unemployment rate. The league's report also provides data that takes a critical look at the lack of progress made during 2 terms of the Obama administration. In 2008 and 2012, African Americans voted overwhelmingly for President Obama, securing his 2 terms in office. The league suggests no matter who is elected to the White House and Congress for 2017, the oppression and exploitation will not go away. In Washington, Ashley Banks, RT.